Welcome. Hello, I'm Michelle Marinkovich, Associate Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education and Director of the Center for Teaching and Learning. And I want to thank you so much for coming to the last in this quarter's series of award-winning Teachers on Teaching. We're extremely lucky today that the Rajiv Motwani Professor of Computer Science, Daphne Koller, has chosen to speak to us about the online revolution, high-quality education for the 100%. Since it seems as though higher education is poised to change more in the next few years than it has in the last several hundred years, we're quite fortunate that one of the pioneers in online education, Daphne, is here to share her thoughts with us. But let me first tell you a little bit about her background. She received her bachelor's in science, cum laude, in math and computer science from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in 1985. She went on to complete a master's in computer science, summa cum laude, just a year later. And then following a stint as a lieutenant in the Israel Defense Forces, I'm not sure I've introduced before a lieutenant in the Israeli Defense Forces, Daphne made her way to Stanford for graduate study, finishing a PhD in computer science in 4 short years in 1993. After 2 years on a postdoc at UC Berkeley, she came back to Stanford as an assistant professor, rose to associate, then to full, and now holds an endowed chair. She describes her complex research interests with elegant clarity and brevity. I'm going to quote her on them. She describes them as using probabilistic models in machine learning to understand complex domains that involve large amounts of uncertainty. What she doesn't say, but which her publications so far, and that includes over 65 journal articles or book chapters or 4 books, show that she's a prolific researcher of bold and diverse interests, ranging from Bayesian networks to robotics and perception to decision-making, probabilistic logic, and that's just a few of them. In dedicated pursuit of this research, she's assembled an envious array of awards, including the Office of Naval Research Young Investigator Award, the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, given in the White House. She was elected as a Fellow of the American Association for Artificial Intelligence and of the National Academy of Engineering. Particularly germane to her appearance in this series, she was appointed the Oswald G. Villard Fellow for Undergraduate Teaching in 2004, the same year she was chosen for a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship. How wonderful that her Genius Award and her Teaching Award came in the same year. More recently, Daphne has been pioneering the world of MOOCs, massive open online courses, with both her own classes and with her development of Coursera, a company and a platform for online courses. I am incredibly honored to turn you over to Professor Daphne Koller.
Thank you, Michelle, for that truly embarrassing introduction. And thank you all for being here. I think there might be some more space in the front if you guys want to come and sit here. I don't know. But anyway, thank you all for coming. I think for all of us who've been reading the publicity in the last month or two around the education space, I think we all realize that we are at an amazing inflection point in the space of education, where education as we know it, higher education specifically, is not going to look anything in 2 years as it has in the last few hundred. Or as President Hennessy said, there's a tsunami coming and it's really looming over our heads. So what are the causes of this inflection point? And I think there's some clear global forces that are driving this transformation. And some of them are as follows. So the first is scarcity. there just is not enough high-quality education to be had in many parts of the world. So one particularly poignant story is the one from South Africa at the beginning of this calendar year. The education system in South Africa was constructed in the days of apartheid for the white minority, and as a consequence, there aren't that many slots at top educational institutions in South Africa to accommodate the much larger population that now wants and deserves a high-quality higher education. So in January of this year, after the normal admissions process at the University of Johannesburg, which is one of the top universities in South Africa, had already concluded, there were a handful of slots remaining open for admissions. And so the day before the admissions for those slots was supposed to open, thousands of people lined up outside the gate of the University of Johannesburg, hoping to be first in line to get one of those coveted slots. And not surprisingly, when the gates opened, there was a stampede. And a couple dozen people were badly injured, and one woman died. She was the mother of a daughter who she wanted to have a higher education so she could make a better life for herself. So this is a real tragedy. And while this particularly sad event is maybe unusual, the scarcity that it represents is not atypical of many developing countries where there just are not enough opportunities for people to make this kind of better life for themselves. Even closer to home, we have a crisis of affordability. Now, this is something that's been in the news a lot recently, so maybe some of the statistics that I'm about to share are familiar to some of you. There's been a lot of talk about the increasing cost of medical care, and we all are familiar with that. And so in this 12-year period from 1984 to 2006, healthcare costs went up by about 250%. What was until recently not quite as familiar to people is that in the same period, the cost of college tuitions went up by 440%, and the most recent numbers that I saw when you go all the way to 2011, are well north of 500. So 540, I think, is the latest number that I saw. Now, that, of course, is what's giving rise to the current crisis of student loan, which is something that we've been hearing a lot about recently. Student loan has more than doubled in the last 12 years. And again, this ends in 2008. If you go to 2012, this is only increasing. And I think that it has the risk for all of us as a society of giving rise to the similar kind of bubble as we had for the mortgage crisis back in 2008. And then, of course, the last piece of this crisis in higher education is that of affordability, is that of quality. So even those students who can somehow obtain higher education often do not end up getting value for their educational dollars and the time that they spent. So only a little bit more than half of the people who got a college education end up working in a job that requires a college degree. Of the remaining half, half are unemployed, and half are working in a job that does not require a college degree. Now that, of course, is not true for those of us who are fortunate enough to study at an educational institution such as Stanford. Our students don't have a problem, by and large, getting jobs that can utilize the skills that they learned in school. But for students who obtain their degrees from a whole myriad of other educational institutions, this is a real problem. So this is three global forces that are really driving the inflection point that we're seeing. And I love this quote from the Tom Friedman article that came out yesterday. I don't know how many of you have read that, is that breakthroughs happen when what is suddenly possible meets what is desperately necessary. So what is suddenly possible, and what I consider to be the direct proximal cause of the current inflection point, the thing that is the immediate cause, are the three large Stanford classes that went out in the fall of 2011. So this is an experiment, a really tremendous experiment that Stanford put in place to take 3 courses and put them up available online for anyone around the world. And these courses were offered by my colleague Andrew Ng, Sebastian Thrun, and Jennifer Whittam in the computer science department. So let's talk a little bit about these classes and how they generated this inflection point. So the machine learning class, which is what I'll use as a running example in this talk, at Stanford is one of the bigger classes that we offer. It has 400 students every time that it's offered. So 4 little people. That same machine learning class offered to the general public had over 100,000 students enrolled. So as Andrew likes to put it, in order for him to reach this audience by teaching his normal Stanford class, he would have had to teach it for 250 years. So the impact of this is enormous, and it's also global. Students from every country around the world were taking this class. There were, I think, over 170 countries represented in the population of students. I'll come back to stats about the class a little bit later on. So what caused these classes to be such an amazingly impactful and significant thing for people around the world? So let's talk about that, because many universities, including Stanford and MIT and Harvard, have been putting online course content available to the world via other mechanisms such as iTunes U for many years now. So what made these different? Oh, sorry, I forgot to talk about this. I'll come back to what made these different in just a moment. My apologies. So what's equally powerful, besides the number of 100,000, is the individual stories that you get from specific individuals whose lives have been totally transformed by having access to this educational experience. So here's one. Howdy, I'm Bill. I pay the bills as an overnight dairy stocker at a grocery store. But now he basically took our classes and is now going back to school in order to change his life. A student who came from a small town in India, never had the luck to go to a high quality, higher education, and now he has this opportunity. A single mom, 39 years old, who wants to go back and get her master's degree. There's story after story of people whose lives have been transformed by having access to this. So again, what made these different? So this is not just a bunch of videos. This is a real course experience that is, I think, as close as we can currently come in existing technology to providing the experience that you would have on campus to people in the general public. So it's not going to be the same as what you can provide to our own local students, but it's as close an approximation as one can get. So what are the components that are part of this experience? First, it's not just a bunch of text on the web. It's actually video-based instruction where the students get to see the instructor and feel like they get to know them. And these have as well in-video quizzes, which I'll talk about. There's real homework with real deadlines. And these homeworks are graded, so the students know if they're doing well or not. And if they don't do their homework, they don't get credit for it. So it's really like taking a class. There is a community that's built around, for example, the question and answer forums. And this community is built because it's a real class with everybody taking the class together, so they're all working on the same things at the same time. And finally, at the end of it, the students actually got something to show that they had achieved something significant. So they got a statement of accomplishment that was signed by the instructor, and that was very important for a lot of the students. So I'll talk for most of the talk about this, and then at the very end I'll talk about how that same set of ideas is also a valuable learning experience for our own Stanford students, and how it can also improve the quality of the education that we offer to our own students here at Stanford. So these are kind of the two main themes. So let me start by talking about each of these in turn. So video-based instruction is something that experience shows that students really like. They prefer that to reading, and we would like students to read, but you know what? Students prefer to watch videos. So if we accept that, we can see that, for example, in the success of Khan Academy with its 3,000 videos and 4 million unique visitors each month. Here at Stanford in 2008, Andrew, in collaboration with several engineering faculty and our friends at the Stanford Center for Professional Development, put together a project called Stanford Engineering Everywhere that has 12 video-only courses, and it's had millions of views since 2008. And then on Coursera, we broke 1 million class signups earlier this week and 10 million video views. So since we launched in March, in the end of March. The other aspect of this is that video is a lot easier for faculty members to create than books. And I have written books and I have prepared an online class, and I can tell you that both are work, but the book is infinitely harder. So I wouldn't recommend that. So this is a lot easier to do. So here's how you would prepare your class in this online format. This is just like a little technology piece of how these classes were created. So there's basically, it's a studio. It's what we call a studio, not a Disney-style studio. There's a little microphone, a webcam, and then a tablet that allows the instructor to write on top of their PowerPoint, which gives this more of an engaging and interactive feel. We have instructors who record in the studio, in their offices, some of them even record at home, and some record in front of a live classroom, especially when you like the interactivity of having students there. So what are some of the benefits of video-based instruction? So the variable speed, the affordances of a video platform actually is in many ways superior to sitting in a lecture and listening to an instructor, because it allows a student a significantly greater amount of control over their own learning. So when I teach in class, I often stand there and blather on, sort of talking slowly and writing on the board, because I know that if I lose somebody in, halfway through the lecture, chances are they will never be able to regain it, and the whole lecture will just be totally lost. Here, because it's on video, there is the opportunity for students to pause, rewind, or if they're getting it and it's all kind of familiar to them, or if I've fallen back into the blathering on, they can play at an accelerated speed. There's also the opportunity to add subtitles as well as translations, which are really important for students with hearing disabilities, with learning disabilities, and to foreign language speakers. So let me show you, what this is like. And you'll see this is my colleague, Dan Bonnet, from the computer science department, teaching his crypto class.
Introduce our friends, Alice and Bob, who are going to be with us throughout the quarter. Essentially, Alice is trying to communicate securely with Bob. Here, Alice is on the laptop, and Bob is on the server. The protocol that's used to do that is called HTTPS, but in fact, the actual protocol is called SSL, sometimes it's called TLS. And the goals of these protocols are basically to make sure that as data travels across the network, an attacker, first of all, can't eavesdrop on this data, and second of all, an attacker can't modify the data while it's in the network. So no eavesdropping and no tampering. Now,
so the interesting thing is the accelerated playback with the subtitles actually works. You can follow it, and you can see that there's translations into multiple languages. These are all produced by the students in the class. The translations are produced by the students in the class because they are so grateful to be given access to this kind of education that they just want to help their fellow countrymen who are not quite as proficient in English have access to the material. Okay. A second piece of it is that we consciously moved away from the hour-long monolithic videos that are typical of standard lecture capture, for example. So the idea here is that we take the lecture, we break it up into coherent short modules of the 8, 10, maybe 15 minutes, each of which is coherent on its own, and you can organize them into a dependency graph that shows you the different orders in which you can traverse the material and what depends on what. So this is a concept map, as we call it, for my class, probabilistic graphical models, and so each of these circles is one of those video units, video chunks, and this shows the dependencies between them. And these are much better suited to students' attention spans, and I can tell you that when our chunks go a little bit long, so they go into 15 or 18 minutes, we get complaints on the forum. And by the way, this is particularly valuable for public students who often try and fit in learning units in a coffee break or in the time before they go to bed or something like that. So this is really important for them. It also, by having this kind of different flows, allows the students to adapt their learning to their interests as well as skill levels. So students who need more extra background, for example, can do certain prep modules that might not be relevant for others. Some students might want to go into depth in a particular area. Some examples might be more motivating to students from a social sciences background, and others might be more motivating to students with a science background. So all of this can be done and allows us to move away from the one-size-fits-all teaching that we have to do when we have one lecture and 400 students. And then finally, because of the modularity of this, it's much easier for instructors to adjust this over time by correcting errors, by putting in new content to replace content that's out of date, and so on and so forth. So that's the video piece, but I think that's the least interesting piece of this. Far more interesting is the issue of assessment. Now, assessments has come to be a bad word in many circles because people associate it with No Child Left Behind, with standardized testing. But I think what drove us in the use of this and in the fact that this is a key part of every part of the student experience is that students learn by actively interacting with the material. They do not learn just by sitting and passively watching watching videos. And so assessments has turned out to be a critical part of what we try to put in here. Now, there's a lot of educational research that supports that. Here's one study that I'm particularly fond of. This is a part of a long series of works by these authors, but there's also others that have demonstrated that being tested on content is actually a valuable learning tool. So here's the study. What it did is you have 4 populations: the ones who just studied a material, the ones who studied and then had time to review before a test, the ones who studied and then did some concept mapping, and then which is a way of figuring out how different concepts they learned fit together. And then the last population, the green bar, are the ones who were forced to take a short retrieval exam about the material that they learned. Okay? So they were tested. And you can see what we see here is the graph of their performance on a test given a couple weeks later. And you can see that this population considerably outperforms all the others, both on verbatim retrieval questions as well as inference or comprehension questions. Can you use the material? And the theory in this paper and others is that the act of retrieving something builds pathways in the brain that makes the material much more accessible and hence much more usable in problem solving. So how did we build in assessments into the platform? They occur in 2 different places. The first is what we call in-video quizzes, which are things that occur even within our short video units at regular intervals, so about every 5 minutes. Now, originally when I did this in my class 3.5 years ago, I started doing this more like 8 minutes because I didn't want it to get irritating and so on. Students kept asking for more and more of these. So we ratcheted up the number to the point where now it's every 5 minutes, and there's still about a third of the class that thinks we should have more. This is really a valuable tool for increasing both student engagement and retention. So the analogy that I like to use is we often try and ask students questions in class when we teach them. So when I ask a question in class, 80% of the students are still scribbling the last thing I said. 15% are on Facebook. And then there's the smarty pants in the front row who answers the question before anybody else has had a chance to think about this. And I'm really happy because somebody actually answered my question correctly. So it's great. But most students haven't even had a chance to think about this. So here, as you'll see in the video in just a second, the video actually stops and every single student is forced to think about the question. And if they're not getting it, it's a real warning indicator for them that maybe they're not keeping track of the material. And the nice thing about that is that unlike in a live classroom, once they realize that, they have the opportunity to go back and rewind and pay attention again, and maybe this time they'll know the answer. And so again, this increases the students' both understanding and control over their own learning. And as I said, the students really like them. So let me show you what an in-video quiz looks like. So this again is from Dan Bonnet's class.
So now let me ask you, when we decrypt the ciphertext, what is it going to decrypt to?
And so the video pauses, and the student enters the answer, and we're cut off the right, I'm sorry. And they got the answer, if they were told the answer is incorrect, and now it's correct, and an explanation pops up that the student can read. And now the class continues.
Well, I hope everybody sees that manipulating XORs, basically the decryption.
So you can see why the students really like this, because it really makes them figure out whether they understand the material or not. Okay. So what kinds of assessments does the platform that we put together support? So multiple choice is a fairly obvious generic one of different types. Numerical checking, both for exact answers as well as, if you want to allow a bit of a fudge factor to allow for numerical imprecision. Short answer, that was an example that you just saw a moment ago. I'll show another more interesting one in just a second. So free text short answers. And then ones that I'll talk about at a little bit greater length, the ability to grade structured outputs. This includes both programming assignments as well as Excel spreadsheets and a variety of other things. Peer assessment is the biggest push that we've done recently, and I'll talk about that for quite a bit. And then the ability to grade math in interesting ways. So here's an example of a short answer question. So the state of Minnesota, Veterans Administration, blah, blah, blah. What behavioral model is the governor most likely using? And this is the answer. The governor is using the rational choice model. And the system, by doing simple, not very sophisticated at the moment, text processing, is looking for rational choice and model in the appropriate context. And so not very sophisticated right now, and we have ways of improving that, but it definitely allows a much richer experience for the students than just multiple choice, where they actually have to actively retrieve this answer as opposed to just pick it from a list. Structured output. So structured output falls into multiple categories. So some are programming assignments where the students have to submit their work and are graded on the correctness of what they submitted. That is, did they submit a program whose output is what is consistent with what the instructor's output should have, what the instructor says the output should have been. Now, it doesn't just grade on correctness. We can also grade on timing, on memory use, and more interesting, on actual performance on a task that you care about. So for example, my class, which has machine learning elements, we gave the students a set of data to train on and measure how well they performed on that set of instances. And then we're given instances that they haven't seen. They were supposed to produce answers without knowing what the answers should have been. And then we basically tested how well they achieve at this particular performance task. So now this is nice because it allows for totally creative problem solving. That is, they weren't supposed to come up with a particular answer. They were supposed to come up with a good answer, one that actually achieved good performance. And so we did one for spell checking. We did one for action recognition from a Kinect sensor. So really, out-of-the-box problem solving can all be auto-graded as well. So let me show you an example of that. Let me see if I can get this to fit in the screen. Okay. So this is from the CS 101 class taught by Nick Parlante in our department, and they're trying, the student's supposed to try and get this thing to be color corrected, and you can see that it's better, but it's still not good, and so it's still not listed as correct. The student enters another answer, and now it's correct, and the student can now move on. This is the same thing for an Excel spreadsheet, which is something that you could use to grade financial models, business models, as well as data analysis. And this is this is client side, a student submitting a MATLAB program that has very sophisticated functionality, and they submit in the MATLAB window, and it's submitted to the server, checked, and they're told whether it's correct or not. Okay. So we talked about Excel spreadsheets. Now, one nice thing about this that is you can get by a combination of auto-grading and very large scales is that you can discover what confuses students. So in the machine learning class in the fall, there were 2,000 students in Andrew's machine learning class that submitted the exact same wrong answer. Now, you have in a class of 100, 2 students who submit the exact same wrong answer, you'll never notice. But if you have, in a class of 100,000, 2,000 identical submissions, it raises a warning signal. So the system detected this sort of confluence and pointed it out to the TAs. And the TAs looked into some example programs that students had submitted and realized that the mistake that all of these students had made was that they inverted 2 lines of an algorithm. So instead of doing them in A-B order, they did B-A. So what you could then do is basically every assignment that has this particular functionality, this behavior, now gets shunted into a targeted error message where the students are told that you might want to think about this routine and you might want to check it to and compare it to the algorithm that you're supposed to be implementing. So you can now really give students much more tailored feedback that enhances their learning in a way that you really couldn't do in other formats. And this is a critical part of the assessment process. Now, this, of course, doesn't cover all courses, and as part of our discussions with different instructors at different universities, we realized that for large populations of courses, of instructors, we couldn't make do with this kind of assessment as the only form. So you go and tell a poetry professor that they have to use multiple choice for grading, and good luck to you with that. So we considered various other forms of grading. We considered briefly robo-graders for essays, and we can talk later if you care why we discarded that option. And we ended up following the solution of peer assessment. So first let me talk about why peer assessment works and why it's a valuable thing to do, and then we'll tell you about the peer grading pipeline and how we designed it. So This is a graph. This is from a very famous paper by Sadler and Good, 2006, that talks about both peer grading as well as self-grading. So what you see here on the x-axis is the teacher-assigned grade for a piece of work. On the y-axis is the student-assigned grade. And I know most of you probably can't see, but there's both dots and crosses. The dots are peer grading and the crosses are self-grading. And what you see is, by and large, a very good correlation between the teacher-assigned grade and the peer-assigned grades. And an even better correlation between the teacher-assigned grade and the self-assigned grade, which basically shows that if designed correctly, and I'll talk about that, student-based grading is something that can actually be reliable in terms of providing the students with actual grades, with accurate grades. But what's equally important, I mean, this is critical in order to allow grading at scale, because one thing you can't do is have 100,000 essays be graded by TAs. So that's pretty clear. So this allows grading at scale, but it also is a useful pedagogical exercise. So what you see here from the same paper is the students broken into 3 populations based on their performance on an exam before they started taking the class. So the lower third, the middle third, and the upper third. And what you see here is the improvement in their performance over by virtue of taking the class. So higher means that their performance improved. So the white bar are the control population, the people who didn't get to grade either their own work or their peers' work. The black line are the peer graders, and the gray bar are the self-graders. And what's clear here is that peer grading provides an improvement over the control in 2 out of the 3 populations. And self-grading actually provides an improvement over the control in all 3 of these populations. So this is a useful pedagogical exercise for teaching people how to do, have a better understanding of their own work, and then hopefully do better at the end. So the key to doing this and achieve this kind of result by reading this paper and others is the availability of a very carefully designed grading rubric. So the instructor has to put together a set of guiding questions, as well as some guidelines about what constitutes a good answer, a medium answer, and a bad answer for each of those factors separately. You can't just tell people, go and grade this and tell me if you think it's an A or a B or a C. You need to give much more specific guidelines. And this is also insight that we got by putting in ideas from the crowdsourcing literature, which is something that's very common now in computer science. So with a grading rubric, this is what the pipeline looks like. So the students submit the assignment right here. This is the deadline. After the deadline, the students are given the grading rubric, and now they are trained. They are placed into a mini TA boot camp. And this is all students in the class are given this TA-like training. And the way it works is the following. They're given assignments that the instructor graded. And they're supposed to grade them, but they don't know what the instructor grades are. And then the system automatically compares the instructor grades to the student grades and sees if they're sort of close enough. If they're close enough for, say, 2 or 3 assignments, then the student has demonstrated the ability to correctly apply the grading rubric, and they can now go and apply that to their actual peers' work. But until they do that, they keep being trained until they know what they're doing. And so this is the so-called calibration phase. And then when that happens, the peer grading happens, and each student's work is usually graded by at least 4 or 5 of their peers to allow for inaccuracies and people who don't really know how to grade. And then there's an optional self-grading phase, and then ultimately the students see the grade, they see the feedback from their peers, and they can also see, for example, how other peers graded the same work that they graded, so they can say, oh, I was high on that but low on this other thing, so you can also learn to understand how different people view a piece of work. And then you can also potentially see the really good submissions, so that you learn what a really good piece of work looks like. And all this is entirely automated. That is, the entire pipeline is automated so it can be applied at scale to 100,000 students. And by the way, this is based on the ideas of calibrated peer reviews that were originated in UCLA back in 2001, but adapted to this much more massive scale. So this is the kind of output that a student gets. This is an actual screenshot from the system. A student actually uploaded, in this case, a design. This is an HCI. This is currently for a human-computer interaction class. So the student uploaded a design. Here is the aggregate score that they got, and here is actual concrete free text feedback from their students, which is one of the main differences and the main reasons for doing peer grading rather than, say, robo-grading, because you actually get meaningful feedback about your work as opposed to just a score. This is assuming we believe that you could actually automatically score, which obviously this you couldn't do anyway. So. And by the way, the fact that this is a human-computer interaction class that's going to use this first is an interesting one, because the original impetus for doing this was mostly for humanities and social sciences courses. But as soon as engineering faculty found that we had this in place, everybody wants to grade open-end work. So, so now everybody wants to use this. Okay. The final type of assessment is math. And imagine here that you want students to grade an open-ended mathematical derivation. So here's a simple one. You're supposed to take the derivative of this e to the x plus x function. You can't really ask students to do a derivation via multiple choice. It just doesn't work. So in collaboration with my colleague Alex Aiken and 2 students in the department, we built up the system that works as follows. The instructor writes down a set of transformation rules that are legitimate to use. For example, the chain rule for derivatives. And then the student is supposed to produce in free-form math notation, just the way they would write it on a piece of paper, only it's in the computer, a set of steps, each justified by one of the rules that the instructor said were okay to use. Now, this is a really valuable, not just as an assessment tool, but also as a learning tool. So I've graded probably more than my fair share of mathematical derivations in my life, and I can tell you that even Stanford students don't necessarily recognize that their derivations are incorrect. So students have the tendency of writing down a bunch of steps that they think are going in the right direction, and they get stuck. And then they write the magical and therefore step. And all of a sudden they're where they need to be. And they don't even know that it's not correct. So here they're actually told, no, this is not a legitimate step. You want to go back and rethink this. But you can do more than that. You can tell students, yeah, this is a legitimate step, but 90% of the students who took that step didn't end up getting to the right answer. So you might want to think about doing something else. And so it's a really valuable way of giving students guidance on how to do a derivation. And this is currently running in the compilers class, which Alex Aiken himself is teaching, but we're also planning to field it in the context of a calculus class that's coming up in the fall, and a variety of other math-heavy courses that could really benefit from this. The final piece of the automated grading is not just the scalability of it. It's the fact that automated grading allows us to come close to a dream that was first posed by Benjamin Bloom back in 1983, so many years ago now, 30 years almost. So this is a paper, a seminal paper, that some of you might have read. It's called the 2 sigma problem. So let me explain what the 2 sigma is and why it's a problem. So here's a graph from the Bloom paper. X-axis is different achievement scores. Y-axis is the number of people who achieved that score. So the graph on the left are the people who were taught using a traditional lecture-based methodology, the way we teach most of our classes. So to understand that, let's look at a population. Let's put an imaginary line at the median performance. So in this lecture-based format, half of the class is above that level. That's the blue, and half is below that level. The curve next to it on the right is what's called the mastery-based learning group. They were still taught in a lecture-based format, but they weren't allowed to move to the next concept before they demonstrated mastery of the previous one. And so that curve is a standard deviation, a full sigma or standard deviation better than the standard lecture-based classroom. So to illustrate that, using that same threshold that we put here, now 84% of the students are going to be, no, 86, so, no, 84, sorry. 84% of the population is above that same level of performance. Okay? That's 1 sigma. The curve on the right is when you add personalization. That is when it's not just mastery-based, but you have an individual human tutor that's sending you in the right direction and helping you along. Now, that achieves 2 standard deviations, or 2 sigma, of performance relative to the lecture-based classroom, to the point where 98% now achieve that baseline level of performance that was the median in the lecture-based class. So imagine if we could take our current median performance and have 98% of the students be in the top half of the class. Wouldn't that be really cool, right? Now, the problem, of course, And that's why Bloom called it the 2 sigma problem, is that we can't afford an individual human tutor for every student. And so the question is, how do you get close to that in an economically affordable way? So mastery, you can do using a computer, because the nice thing about a computer is it doesn't get tired of grading. You can give it the same assignment or similar assignments to grade again and again, and it will continue doing so very patiently until you get it. And because the student feedback is immediate, they know that they're not getting it, and they have a chance to actually get that working, as opposed to the current paradigm in instruction, where I teach a concept week 1, I assign the problem set week 2, the students submit it week 3, it's week 5 before they get it back, and then they look at the assignment and say, darn it, I got 70 out of 100, that's too bad, and they stick it in their binder, and that's the end of the learning experience for most of them. Here, mastery is achievable. Personalization, we're not quite there yet. That's going to require, I think, a bit more work and maybe even some machine learning and artificial intelligence. But we can do some of that by the ability for students to self-navigate through the curriculum in ways that suit their own learning styles. And so not quite there yet, but maybe a little bit of the way. So how is mastery built into this? By allowing students to submit and resubmit the same work, but since you don't want them to just rote memorize the answers, there's a lot of ability to randomize built into this. So in the same way that if you take the DMV exam for a second time, you don't get the same set of questions that you got the first time, randomization is built into the platform in a way that students can really attempt the same work multiple times and not just have exactly the same questions and answers. So when a student submits a quiz, they get a screen that looks like this, and they're told that some answers are correct and some answers are incorrect, and then there's like a short explanation. And the student, if they reattempt that same quiz, will get a somewhat different set of questions and answers. And mastery actually happens. So this is from my Stanford class, but we get the exact same curves in the public class. So what you see in the top graph is the blue bars are the student's score in their first submission, and you can see that it's a nice bell-shaped curve around about 60 out of 6 or so out of 8. And the green bar is what happens when the students submit the same quiz but not the exact same questions again, and you can see that now the performance is really sharply peaked to the right, to the point that the median grade in most of my assignments was actually 100%. So that really is a way for students to achieve mastery in what they're learning and maybe come close to the Bloom vision from 1983. The last piece of the puzzle in terms of what makes this so much different than other previous online learning attempts is the fact that because these classes were semi-synchronous. Now, what does semi-synchronous mean? It means that the course starts on a given day. There's weekly deadlines that everyone is doing together. And so there is a real sense of community around the material, because if you're learning about a particular topic or struggling with a particular problem set, so is everybody else in the class. So there's 100,000 people around the world who are working on the same things. And so let's talk a little bit about the community and some of the pieces here. So first of all, this is a country map where the size is proportional to the square root of the number of participants. So obviously, US is still very large, followed by UK, Russia, India, and Brazil are our 5 largest countries. But you can see that there's a lot of other countries represented: Ukraine, France. If you squint, you can also see a reasonable number of African nations. So South Africa, Nigeria is here somewhere, Kenya, here's Nigeria. And so really a very broad representation, Bangladesh, and so on. So this is kind of gratifying. Students self-assembled into study groups that used different focal points, whether it's nationality, language, ethnic origin, geographical proximity, or a range of other things that made them group together. So here is our Russian study group, Poland, Arab speakers, globalized, people who want to have a more global study group, and so on. And people just self-assembled. I think there were 50 people in the London study group. That all were, and they actually met in person to do some of the work together. Students did not the majority, in fact, the entirety of answering each other's questions. So one of the key design to scale factors in the design of this was, how do you build a question and answer form that works for 100,000 people? It's not that hard to build a question and answer form that works for 100 people. But if you have 100,000 students and each asks one question, the form becomes totally unusable. And so there's different pieces of this that made the form usable. First is the idea that we adopted from the Stack Overflow model, where questions are voted up and down by students and answers are voted up and down, so that the best questions bubble to the top and the most useful answers bubble to the top. And the students really answered each other's questions in a very useful way and helped each other along over the hard bits. So an interesting statistic around this is that in the fall quarter class, the median answer time for a question posted on the forum was 22 minutes. Now, I have never given that level of service to my class. And the reason for this is that if there's 100,000 students all around the world, if you're up at 3 o'clock in the morning struggling with problem set 3, then somewhere around the world there's likely another person logged onto the forum thinking about the same thing, and you can start a conversation about that. And so this built up this amazing sense of community where people were helping each other along over the hard bits. A new development that I actually instituted in the public class this year, and other classes are now starting to adopt this, is the notion of community TAs. So since my class was offered only for the first time in the public format, I asked the best students in my Stanford class if they want to be volunteer community TAs. So they would have, they would be called community TAs, and they would be able to log into the forum on the public class and answer questions, and maybe once or twice a week. Of the ones that I asked, about half said yes for 2 different reasons. Some of them said that they just wanted to give something back. And some of them said that they knew that teaching others was the best way to really learn the material. So we had both arguments manifesting. And so community TAs are giving really detailed and useful answers, especially for the more challenging questions that that maybe the students in the class can't answer. In the Berkeley Software as a Service cloud computing class, they're now relaunching their public class for the second time. They have 45 community TAs selected from the previous offering of the public class. So people really do want to give back here. A final aspect of the community is, these are 2 of my colleagues, Yoav Shoham from computer science and Matt Jackson from economics. They co-taught a game theory class, and they had weekly office hours on the web, on a Google Hangout, where people would log in from different places in the world and would ask questions, and there would be kind of a little conversation about that. And other people could watch. They couldn't all participate actively, of course, but there was a large passive viewership who could watch, and then it was also recorded and edited and posted in addition to that. Okay, so the last piece that I want to talk about is the statistics for the class and some potential for the analytics, because there's, I think, a tremendous opportunity there for learning science. So let me first just do some basic stats on the class. So this is, again, the fall quarter class. This is the date that the first lectures are posted. So what you see here is x-axis is time, y-axis is number of students, some number of users on the site. What do you think the peaks are? Deadlines. Seems procrastination is a global phenomenon. So the deadlines were on Monday, and every weekend people would religiously log in, and we were actually told by people at parties and stuff, oh, I can't stay to talk to you right now, I have to go and do your homework. So it's happened to Andrew once or twice. So here's another interesting stat. This is what's called reach, daily number of unique users from Alexa, which collects these kinds of statistics. The 3 lines over here are the 3 Stanford classes. Blue is machine learning, red is databases, and this is the yellow is the AI class. What you see over here is the Khan Academy daily reach. Now, Khan Academy does all of K through 12 math, much of K through 12 science, and a whole bunch of other things as well. What's interesting is that these 3 classes together are at about the same reach as Khan Academy, which again just illustrates the hunger for this kind of learning and the opportunity there. A few more stats. These are the initial enrollments for the 3 classes. But I think if we want to compute completion statistics, the right denominator is not this, but this. because this is, you had to put in your email address to even know what the class was about, to even look at the first video. And so a lot of people came in, said, no, this is not for me, and they basically left. So the right denominator for completion is this number over here, which is the number of students who submitted at least one piece of work. And those are the ones who at least intended to take the class. Now, of these 40, so let's focus on the machine learning class for a moment. Of the students in the machine learning class, the about 46,000+ who tried to engage with the material, about 23,000 actually completed most of the work in the class, which is a completion rate of 50%, which is commensurate with what you have in the Open University UK, for example, which is where people pay to take classes. So their incentive to drop is, considerably lower, one would think. Now, Andrew set a very high grading curve because he wanted to maintain high academic standards. So of those 23,000, only about 13,000 got a statement of accomplishment at the end. But that's still, even if you just look at that, that's still a very high completion rate for these classes. Some more stats. This is from the machine learning class, so one really should expect a very heavily techie bias. We don't have stats from some of the newer classes yet because most of them haven't started, the ones that are more in the humanities. But here, for example, is the age distribution. So you have a large cohort of young learners, people who are college age, but the largest population is actually the 26 through 35, which are the continuing learners, the ones who by and large already have a college degree and want to extend their education. And then it kind of tapers off from there, but we know that there's a long tail here. There were several people who were under 18, basically high school students who were taking this, and at least one retired grandmother who just wanted to learn about machine learning. This is male-centric. It's a techie class, unfortunate, but there it is. That's changing, I think, as overall on the site. And then the primary reason for taking the class, most of them just wanted to get a better job or do better on the jobs that they already have. There was a very large proportion of people who were just curious about the topic. And then we actually had, and you'll see that on the next slide, current college students whose institution does not offer a class like this. And so this is, for example, this one. Okay. So here is, again, a different view of the demographics. So college students, a very large population, professionals in the software industry, a good number of unemployed people, I think, who are trying to become employed by developing their job skills, K-12, and so on. And then this one is not atypical. And you actually get some very poignant emails. We got one the other day about somebody who really did sound desperate and talked about how this had changed her life because this was her only opportunity to break outside the box that she felt she was trapped in. So now let's talk a little bit about analytics. This is an absolutely unique data set for two reasons. The first is the level of detail, and the second is the scope. The scale. So in terms of level of detail, you collect every single click. Where did a person pause? Where did they rewind? What did they watch at 1.2x or 1.5x? Which quiz answer did they give first and which one did they give second? And what did they do in the middle between giving one answer and giving the other? And did it help them? So the detail here is just unprecedented in terms of the kinds of questions that one can ask about human learning, both at the broad scale, like what is a good strategy for people, what makes people learn better or not, in terms of the medium scale of, in a particular class, what's important and what guidance can we give the instructor on how to teach better, and then at the individual student level, for the student, should they do this next or that next? And those are all things that we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of. So let me show you some examples of analytics that we just started doing. This is a project that a postdoc here in the computer science department was doing again on the machine learning class data from the fall. So what you see here is the probability that after watching lecture I, a student moved to watching lecture J. So you see an obvious diagonal because most students just watched in the linear order that was listed on the website. But you can see that there is a blockiness structure that corresponds to higher level modules. Or larger topics within the material. And what's more interesting is that you see some off-diagonal elements that are very far from the diagonal and don't belong in the same module. And these are lectures where the students went back to review certain key concepts that were helpful for them in improving their learning. So for example, here it turned out that linear algebra was a topic people kept coming back to, for example. You can ask what helps students learn. So again, this is just a very, very preliminary example of this. So the question is, this is on a programming assignment. Assume that the students submitted an incorrect assignment and maybe a second incorrect assignment, and eventually they submitted a correct version. What distinguished this from this? That is, what did they do here that got them to the right answer? So we focused here on the forum posts. And the question was, which forum post most significantly increased the probability of getting from here to here versus staying at a wrong answer? And so you could now start looking at what those forum posts are. And here's one example. This is a question number 830. And there is a fairly significant probability gap between, transitioning to the right answer after viewing it versus if you didn't view it. And if you look at the question, it hammers in on one of the most common misconceptions that occurred in this programming assignment. So this is a really useful hint either for the instructor to tell them, maybe you should have explained this better, or to the student in terms of telling them, if you're struggling with this programming assignment, you want to go look at this forum post and maybe it'll help you. And so you can use this in very different ways. And then I guess the final type of stats is, students really, really liked it. So this is 6 and 5, and you can see there's a huge peak and then only a very small tail of people who had issues. This is Tim Roughgarden's algorithms class. It's really very positive comments across the board. And so let me conclude by talking about how this can all help our on-campus teaching. People ask, and I'm sure this question is in many of your minds as well, if we're offering this amazing course experience free to everyone around the world, why would people want to pay $40,000 a year for Stanford education? And the point here is that this isn't a Stanford education. You could do a lot more with a Stanford education than just these online classes. And that's something that we really want to stress as part of this. And in fact, for many of the universities that are working with us, this was in fact the motivation for engaging. So if you read, for example, President Shirley Tilghman from Princeton talked about the benefits to on-campus students before she even mentioned the public good component of this project. So, the idea here, and in fact this is where I started this started on this project 4 years ago now, is the idea of a flipped classroom. So we were doing flipped classrooms long before they became popular in the media. And the idea was, why should we come into our class and teach the same lecture that we've taught for 15 years, telling the same jokes at the same time? And when students ask a question, you say, didn't I just say that? And you realize that, no, it was last year that you said that, not this year. So this doesn't seem like the best use of either faculty time or student time. And so the question is, why not record those lectures in the same format that I just talked about, which is actually in many ways an enhanced student experience over sitting in a dark auditorium with 400 people, and then use the classroom time for more interesting things. And so the idea of using class time for active learning is not something that we came up with. Here is another really beautiful paper by Nobel Prize-winning physicist Carl Wieman, who's tried this strategy out in multiple different types of classes. Here is one of the larger experiments of this type, where they had two populations, each of about 270 students. The population on the left had a traditional lecture-based class. The population on the right had an active learning strategy. And you see improvements in every single metric: attendance, student engagement, and the more objective, how well did you learn the material, is measured by a standardized test at the end. And the improvements are not 5%, they're 30%. And they showed this in not just the physics class, which is this experiment, but in many other classes as well. So how can we transform our classes to move to this kind of model? And so what are some of the things that I did in my class, for example? I've been doing this for 3 years now in my class. So the first is what's called just-in-time teaching, where you come into class knowing exactly what the quiz from that week, what the results were. So you know what people got right, but you also know what the most common mistakes were. And you can spend time in class not talking in general about all the things that you might talk about, but targeted to the mistakes that people made, which is making much better use of class time. Higher level discussion of the material and how it fits together, the kind of broad overview that we rarely have time for in teaching, because you have to finish covering the material, because otherwise they can't do the problem set. I brought in people from industry to present real-world applications. So somebody from Google came and talked about how probabilistic models were useful in Google's search engine and recommendation engine. And that was useful because it made the material much more alive and motivated to the students. And he also highlighted some of the design constraints of applying these ideas in a practical application as opposed to the more academic setting that students are typically thinking about. And so thinking about what are sort of the design constraints that you need to consider in the real world. We did a lot of interactive problem solving in small teams along the lines of what Wyman had proposed, where students would get together, they would be posed up in small teams. I would pose a problem, students would work on it for 10, 15 minutes, the TAs and I would wander around giving some guidance, and then different teams would present solutions and we would discuss the relative merits of different approaches. Now, here's an interesting statistic. In order not to increase the workload in my class as a whole, because all the content was on video, so why should students also come to class? I basically said I was not going to cover any new material in these so-called interactive sessions. So these were completely optional and attendance was not taken. Furthermore, all of these lectures were recorded on SCPD because they needed to be made available to industry students who were registered in the class. And my classes have always been recorded for SCPD. Now, when you have a recorded class that's made available to Stanford students, for my class as well as for any other, attendance typically drops to about 30% of enrollment by the third week of classes, except if you're teaching at 9 o'clock in the morning, at which point it's 15%. In these interactive sessions, people told me they're optional and they're recorded. You're going to have 3 people coming to class. Turned out to be not true. Attendance at these things was more like 60 to 80% throughout the quarter as compared to the 30% that I'd had before. So students actually saw the value of coming to these sessions much more so than to the traditional lecturing. So to summarize, I'll go through this quickly because we've discussed most of these. The enhanced interaction with immediate feedback is equally valuable to our on-campus students as it is to public students. The individual tailoring of the course material. This is one that most people don't think about, but is really true, and we've gotten emails and comments about that. If you take a student who comes in from a less advantaged background, or who come in, maybe they're a minority, a gender minority, or a racial minority, they often underperform relative to their abilities because they are less confident, they don't ask questions, they fall behind because they don't seek help because they're afraid of being perceived as stupid, and basically a lot of them drop out, especially of STEM disciplines. This environment is considerably less threatening to students because if you watch the same video 7 times, nobody knows. It's okay. And if you attempt the same quiz multiple times, that's also okay. And questions on the forum can be asked anonymously. So we don't know who's asking the question. And again, there's a lot less fear of being perceived as stupid. And so students can really build up confidence as well as skills before they move on to the next more challenging scenario. And our Dean of Education, Claude Steele, has studied extensively this notion of stereotype threat and how it causes students from minority populations to underperform. This online environment might be a way of, to some extent, circumventing that. Talked about analytics and the time for meaningful engagements between students and faculty. And then finally, I think this is an important point for us to think about. The tsunami, as John Hennessy said, is coming. And content is going to become a commodity that people are going to be able to get for free from a variety of different sources. So what is the value that an institution such as Stanford can provide to our students? That value is exactly in this interaction and problem solving and teamwork and working together with your peers and together with a faculty mentor. That is the real value proposition for a student of coming to a place like Stanford. It's not in sitting in a large auditorium listening to a lecture, because lectures are going to become a commodity. And so I think we and other institutions just need to adjust to that. So, to summarize where we are, currently we're able to offer 40 courses from Princeton, Stanford, University of Pennsylvania, University of Michigan, and Berkeley. We're particularly proud of the range of disciplines that we can support. It's okay to do maybe some amount of science or computer science with multiple choice or programming assignment grading, but the ability to support courses in the humanities, social sciences, business and finance, ethics and policy is something that we're particularly proud of. And so let me just conclude with a video that we really like, which kind of shows how it all gets put together.
Welcome to Calculus. 50 million people are uninsured.
Of how to bring people back to life after their heart is
to
stopped.
be able to design drugs.
Fantasy is a key term, both in psychology.
There is a whole world of American poetry and poetics.
To become an explorer of the world of music.
Network analysis draws from graph theory and mathematics.
Models help us organize information. They help us make better predictions. They help us design more effective institutions and policy.
Neighbors like them. And if we run this, we get unbelievable segregation.
The basic idea behind Deduce It is to allow students to work through formal derivations and to have...
We've got a mixed strategy equilibrium. These are the relative probabilities that the different actions are played.
For each pixel in the image, set the red to 0. So let's see what that looks like.
It sounds. So, does Lufthansa serve breakfast in San Jose? Well, that sounds funny.
So this is which coin you pick. This is the t-tosses. Now, let's think about...
So in large-scale machine learning, we'd like to come up with computationally reasonable ways or computationally efficient ways to deal with very big data sets.
Thank you very much. And I'm happy to take questions. Yeah. Yes?
Curious, as an instructor, what are the challenges for teaching
There are two challenges, one of which I think is considerably larger than the other. The first is learning to teach to a video is not that easy, and there's a bit of a learning curve there. That's why you saw my video at the end was actually shot in a classroom. I got a bunch of volunteer students to come and play audience for me so that I could pretend I was actually teaching in a real life class. Much more challenging, though, is thinking about an assessment structure that can do meaningful, deep assessments at using the kind of auto-grading or peer grading technology that one can use to do at-scale grading. Peer grading has helped a lot with that because you no longer have to transform all questions into multiple choice. But still, designing a grading rubric is a non-trivial exercise, and if you've been teaching a class that requires, say, 20-page essay questions or 15-page business plans, this is still not a solution for that. And so one needs to think about how you construct meaningful assessments that can be graded at scale.
I almost hate to ask this question because it's going to make me sound at best skeptical and at worst devious. But in the peer grading, it seems like there's a benefit for people to grade other people poorly and themselves well.
Oh, people don't grade themselves. People do not grade their own work at all.
So what's the self-grading?
Okay, so I forgot. So I apologize for not saying that. The self-grading, you only get your self-grade if it's within a certain tolerance of your peer grade. So you have the incentive to try and guess correctly what other people thought of your work. And you don't get a lot of brownie points for grading other people poorly because in a class of 100,000, if you grade 5, it's not going to change the curve, and we don't grade on a curve anyway. So there's no incentive to penalize your peers. And the calibration phase really helps to make sure that people are sort of doing an okay job and know what they're doing. So I'm glad you asked that question because these are points that are important that I should have made. I think we're going to go around, so that way. Yes. Oh, sorry. In that case, we should start there.
Two quick questions, both having to do with observations and data. First question, that gender imbalance was really, what are you going to do about that? Yeah. And the second one is the data going to be available to
to the participants.
Okay, so first of all, this was a machine learning class. It was an advanced class in computer science. There is a gender imbalance in that field in general. I don't think this was atypical of that gender balance. We haven't done the statistics yet for the new classes, but I'm willing to bet you we're not going to see that imbalance in our intro sociology class. Now, I also hope to be able to correct that gender imbalance in the computing classes using some of the ideas that we talked about, and we have really good ideas on community building and social components in the platform that I think will help attract and retain populations that are not quite as dominant already. And there's a lot of studies, again, in the education literature that show that people who are put together in a cohort with people who are similar to them, either in terms of gender or in terms of socioeconomic or racial background, often retain better, even through difficulties, than ones who don't have that kind of support structure. So by putting in things like study groups much more systematically into the platform and social networking pieces, I think we can help fix that as well.
It'd be nice to see that apply to software engineering.
I want to, okay, so a general comment. The first classes launched 2 months ago, if you don't count the fall quarter classes. And as a company, we only launched a month ago, so just, bear that in mind when you ask us questions about why we haven't done X, Y, or Z yet. The data will be shared back with the instructors as a way of helping them improve their pedagogy. That's part of doing this is you get access to this data. We're not going to just post data on the web for anyone to download because of student privacy issues, but we're definitely open to collaborations with researchers on studying specific educational questions that really this provides unique opportunity. Okay. This and then this. Okay.
First, I just want to say thank you. This is tremendously awesome. My roommate from college actually took this AI course. He lives in Egypt right now.
Cool.
I guess my question I want to ask is your decision to kind of become independent of Stanford and partner with multiple universities. I'm sure this is a big question that you have to think about versus what MIT and Harvard is doing.
Yes.
So if you can speak a little bit to that.
Okay. There's two answers to that question. The important one and the maybe slightly less important but pragmatic one. The important one is that we thought about this in the fall, and when we saw the uptake on these courses, the big question was, how do we scale this up? How do we really make this the impactful transformation of higher education that it could be? And one option was, let's keep this an internal Stanford project and just put Stanford online and bring Stanford to a leadership position on its own in this field of online education. But the thing that guides our thinking for both Andrew and myself and for everyone on the project, down all the way to engineers, everyone, is what's the best thing for the students. And Stanford has amazing content, but it's not the only institution that has amazing content. And there's some topics that are really amazingly well covered by other institutions. And so why should we deprive students around the world from the opportunity to have access to that as part of their education? So that was the real driving force behind this decision. The other component of it is that in our experience, it's actually really hard to do high-end software development in an academic institution. You can bring a graduate student, they can work on something for 3 months, they're really smart and really creative, and they do this for 3 months and then go back and do their thesis, which is what they should be doing, right? If you need something that is robust, is maintained with engineers who need to do all of the grunt work of maintenance and all of the feature tweaking and the A/B testing and all of the things that you need to make this a really great experience for everyone, students as well as instructors, you need engineers who are actually paid competitive rates, who have a vested interest in the success of the venture. And that was the other reason. The first one was the more important one, but the second one, I think, is also a critical role, and it speaks to your ability to execute on this vision. Okay, we're next.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I was quite, I'm curious, one question for you to speculate a bit. Where is this scaling up taking us? And the specific question, do you think we should have 4-year colleges, or it should come down to 3 or 5? What's the impact of this in the amount of time? Because people can come back for booster shots, and you did show that the predominant age range was 20 to 30. Mm-hmm. So there is some implication there that we might not need a 4-year college. It could be shorter with several booster shots.
Well, that is absolutely true. And in fact, I believe that one of the ideas that's being considered here at Stanford by administration is the question of, do students really need to come for a full-length residential program, or can they do some of their education online and only come for part of it to be residential? I don't know whether the thinking is just at the master's level or if there's also some thinking about that at the undergraduate level. I think this is currently very much a topic of decision and discussion at the university levels that I'm not part of. But I think there is a lot of room here for reducing the costs of education. Maybe not at a place like Stanford where the residential experience is so special, but there are so many places where the residential experience is maybe not quite as unique, and you could reduce the costs for students by a very significant margin by allowing them to do part of their education while they're living at home and maybe working a part-time job, and their mother is feeding them and they're doing the laundry in their own washing machine and all that. So I think that that will be a very significant place where we can make higher education considerably more affordable for people even here in the United States.
I'm afraid we're going to have to make that the last question.
Really?
Because of access to the room.
I'm sorry. So this is the last question? Okay.
What I'd like to ask is, what population do you think is going to benefit most from this breakthrough, and who is going to pay most of the cost of it?
Okay, so in terms of the population, I think there's many populations that are going to benefit. And one of the things that we take pride in is the fact that we believe this is going to raise the quality of education to both our on-campus students as well as to students around the world. Now, if you had to sort of try and quantify which of these is the biggest benefit, I would say it's those people, especially in the developing world, where currently access to education is largely non-existent. And this transcends discipline. So it arises for people who maybe want to get a job in technology or in business, and this can help educate them. Think about the impact of healthcare workers, where in the developing world they're largely untrained in any kind of medical education. And here they can now suddenly learn something about medical education for free and help serve their communities better. And so I think the impact on the developing world is going to be much more dramatic even than what benefits we can provide to populations in the United States and at Stanford. Now, in terms of the costs, here's the nice thing about this. Because of the technology that allows hosting and streaming to be done fairly cheaply, and the incremental costs of every additional student are really, really small compared to the cost of content production and building up the system and so on and so forth. So the incremental cost of serving these students in Africa and India is negligible relative to the overall cost of the project. And so I think if we basically say we want to build this up because it's a way of helping bring our education to people, the incremental cost of serving populations that can't afford to help support the effort is negligible, and so we don't really need to worry about who's paying for it. It happens almost for free, that piece of it, which is something that I think is a really unique part of this, and a technological breakthrough that has to do with service in the cloud, with the reduction in costs of internet connectivity, with the ubiquity of mobile devices in much of the developing world, which didn't used to be the case. And so I think all of these are technological factors that are enabling this.